Bees are found in almost all habitats, and they play a really vital role. They might look different, they might have different names, but they almost all do the same basic thing for us and for the environment, and that's that they pollinate plants, and they help make sure that plants can reproduce.
Millions of honeybees, frozen solid and sealed in crates, were carried into the deadliest stretch of the Sahara and left to thaw on open sand. No press knew, no cameras were waiting, just a small team, a remote patch of desert, and one cold question: could anything survive a place built to kill it?
Every second, the sun spits out more energy than humans have used in all our history, and nowhere is its power more potent than in the desert. Amazingly, there are animals that spend their lives in this scorching heat.
When the first lids came off and the bees began to stir, what happened next was so far outside what anyone expected that the people watching instinctively stepped back. Not from fear, from something they couldn't explain and didn't want to say out loud. The frozen cargo. You have to understand why they picked this place. The Tana's Roof is one of the emptiest corners of the Sahara, a region so hostile that old caravan maps used to label it the land of thirst and terror.
When I first arrived in the Sahara, I was just struck by how utterly barren it was. It's like the color green was removed from the palette when they made this place. Just nothing, grays and browns, and not a scrap of life.
And that reputation is exactly what Halima's group wanted. They chose it because no one was watching. No cameras at the perimeter, no press, no government signature on the paperwork. Just a small international team working under a project they only ever referred to by name among themselves. A convoy of sealed crates and a patch of ground so remote that if the whole thing failed, the desert would quietly swallow the evidence and no one would ever know they'd tried. And get this. Inside those crates were millions of honeybees, frozen, held in suspended cold for months. Alive, but only barely. Not pollinators rescued from some rooftop hive. These were test subjects, and the question driving the entire operation was brutally simple. Could life take hold in a landscape engineered to kill it? And not just any life, honeybees specifically, because their needs are some of the best documented in all of biology. We know what they eat. We know how warm they have to stay, how much water they require, how their colonies are supposed to work. That made them perfect for this. If you want to test where the true edge of survival sits, you don't use some hardy extremophile that already thrives in hostile places. You use a creature whose limits everyone thinks they already know by heart. The frozen part mattered too. Holding them in deep cold for months slowed their metabolism almost to a stop, which is the only reason millions of them could be moved into the deep desert at all. But it also meant that when they thawed, they'd wake up starving, disoriented, and instantly exposed, with no slow ramp into the heat. They'd go from near stillness to one of the harshest environments on the planet in a matter of minutes. Here's the catch. The cruelty of the place wasn't a problem to solve. The cruelty was the whole point. Daytime heat that could push past 52 degrees Celsius. Nights that fell back toward freezing. Sand that turned into a blinding wall of storm with almost no warning. No rivers, no real shade. Almost nothing to eat. If a creature could find a foothold here, it could probably find one anywhere on Earth. That was the bet. Halima had spent months on the prep, and she was meticulous about it. Sensors buried across the site to track temperature and humidity, down to fractions of a percent. Drones sweeping the area for days beforehand, hunting for any scrap of opportunity. A moisture pocket, a stubborn cluster of shrubs, a single shaded crevice in the rock. The release conditions had to be exact. Wind direction, time of day, the nearness of any plant at all. One miscalculation in those opening hours could undo everything, because once the bees were out, there was no calling them back. So when that first crate opened and she leaned in and saw what she saw, she didn't share it, not yet. She just told the team to keep filming and to get ready for the rest. The release. Releasing millions of insects into a desert is not something you do all at once, and Halima knew it. You can't just tip the crates and walk away. Each batch had to be timed and placed like a chess move. The wrong hour meant peak heat that would cook them where they landed. The wrong wind meant the bees got scattered across open sand before they could even orient. The wrong spot meant no resources within reach and death inside of minutes. Every release zone was chosen for a reason. Some held thin lines of drought-resistant shrubs. Others had shallow dips in the rock where a little moisture gathered in the gray minutes before dawn. A few offered narrow strips of shade, just enough for a thawing bee to land somewhere that wasn't scorching open ground. And the desert fought them the entire time. The temperature lurched between extremes. Sandstorms rose out of nothing and tore across the terrain, able to erase a fragile knot of insects in seconds. Halima and her data lead sat glued to the satellite feeds, watching for the narrow windows when conditions dropped just far enough to be survivable, then moving fast the moment one cracked open. Tracking the bees afterward was its own nightmare. Millions of insects spreading across miles of empty desert, and standard observation was useless against that. So they went small, microchips and tracking tags light enough not to drag down a bee's flight, fixed in place before the thaw. Drones flying coordinated grids over the dunes. Every signal that pinged back felt like a heartbeat, proof that somewhere out, in all that nothing, something was still alive and moving. There was one moment during the release that Halima still talks about. A storm front showed up on the satellite read sooner than the model said it should, while a batch was already thawing and there was no way to refreeze them. She had a choice, and she had it in about 90 seconds. Hold the batch in the open and risk losing every one of them to the wind, or push the release early into conditions that weren't ideal and hope a fraction made it to cover. She pushed early. She has never been completely sure it was the right call. Some of the survivors that mattered most later came out of that exact batch, and she has never been completely sure that wasn't luck. Here's the deal though, every single batch was a gamble. The bees lifted into blistering air, and for long stretches the desert gave back nothing at all. Some clusters dropped off the sensors within hours and never returned a signal again. By the time the last crate was empty, the team was running on exhaustion and raw adrenaline, and the most ambitious phase of the whole thing was suddenly out of their hands. The Tanasruft held the outcome now. All they could do was watch what it decided to do with them. If a story like this is the kind of thing that keeps you up at night, the kind of question that lodges in your brain and won't leave, take 1 second to subscribe before we go further. What comes next is the part nobody at that site was prepared for, and you are going to want to see how it ends. The first day. The first full day was a slaughter. I need you to picture it the way Halima described it later. Bees falling by the thousands, the desert taking the weak and the strong without distinction, punishing every second a bee spent in open sun without purpose. She stood at the monitors watching the population, counts drop and drop and drop. And at one point, she just said, very quietly, that it felt like watching a door close. Like they had carried these animals all this way only to feed them to the sand. But here's the thing she couldn't stop looking at. Scattered across all that death, small clusters were holding. Groups of bees pressed into tight formations, bodies stacked against each other in arrangements nobody on the team had predicted. Some had found patches of overnight moisture at the base of desert plants. Others clung to sparse acacia branches, to the cool underside of rocks, to any surface that gave them a sliver of relief from the heat. And the question that started eating at Halima that first evening was the one that would drive the entire rest of the experiment. Why these particular bees? What had they done differently? How were they finding water in a place with no visible water anywhere? She started cross-referencing everything. The angle of each landing, the timing of each flight, the way the survivors arranged their bodies. And the patterns surfacing in that data looked unlike anything she had ever read in the literature on this species. Something was happening inside these animals that did not fit the models. She ran the obvious explanations first, because that's what you do. Maybe those clusters just got lucky with shade. Maybe they happened to land near the only moisture for a mile. But the more she looked, the less it held together as luck. The survivors weren't just in better spots. They were behaving differently from the bees dying a few meters away. And they had started behaving differently almost immediately, far too fast for anything she could comfortably explain. By the time the sun went down on day one, she was drained, shaken, and quietly, dangerously curious. The massacre she could explain. The survivors she could not. The adaptation. This is where it stops being a survival story and starts becoming something else entirely. So I want to lay it all out for you in one piece, because what unfolded over the next 3 months was not random. The survivors started building. They burrowed into hollow spaces beneath the sand and into narrow cracks in the rock, carving out enclosed underground chambers that ran dramatically cooler than the surface. And inside those chambers, they organized with real precision, routing pathways for movement, clustering to hold humidity, cutting their exposure to the worst of the day. It was, in the plainest terms, architecture, tiny in scale, staggering in what it implied. Their foraging flipped completely. They stopped flying during the punishing midday hours and concentrated everything into the narrow, cool windows at dawn and dusk. Every flight got deliberate and economical, hovering over the few available blooms with almost surgical accuracy, pulling maximum nectar in minimum time, then dropping back underground before the heat climbed. And water, the thing the desert guards more jealously than anything, they solved in a way that genuinely unsettled the team. With no standing water for miles, the bees started harvesting the faint dew that condensed on plant surfaces overnight. Droplets so small they were almost invisible. They extracted them one careful drop at a time and shared what they gathered back through the group. The infrared footage caught the whole process, the coordinated approach, the precise extraction, the distribution down into the colony. A single wasted droplet could mean death, and they behaved like they knew it. Then there were the physical changes, and this is the part Halima kept circling back to. By the third month, some bees showed darker wing pigmentation and a denser exoskeleton, traits that lined up with better heat resistance and moisture retention. The leg musculature in some individuals was visibly stronger, better built for gripping coarse desert rock. And here's what made her uneasy. These weren't scattered random variations. They pointed in a consistent direction, and they were showing up far faster than any textbook would say was possible. She was careful about it in her notes. She didn't claim to know the mechanism. She wrote it as a question, not an answer, because she knew how it sounded. Heat tolerance traits, dew harvesting behavior, all of it sharpening inside a single season, in a population that everyone assumed was locked into needs that hadn't changed in a very long time. By the end of the third month, Halima stopped using the word survivors in her logs. She started writing pioneers, because that's what they had become. They hadn't just held on. They had carved a niche into the deadliest landscape on the planet, and they were keeping it. And that raised a far bigger question, one she wasn't ready to write down yet. If they could change this fast just to survive, what would they do to the land around them? The desert shifts. By the 6th month, the team realized the bees weren't only adapting to the desert was starting to adapt to the bees. The vegetation in the high activity zones had visibly changed. Flowers were opening more fully and more often, and get this, seed production in certain shrub species had climbed by nearly a quarter, almost 25%, in an environment where nobody expected any measurable change at all. Plants that had sat in near dormancy for years were suddenly functioning at a level that should not have been possible without a dedicated pollinator working them every cool morning.
Among the top 100 crops that make up 90% of people's diets around the world, bees are responsible for pollinating more than 70 of them. It's easy to take bees for granted, so one way to appreciate them is to imagine what would happen if they were to disappear. What would it be like to have a world without bees?
The soil told the same story. Nitrogen levels were rising around the active colonies. Microbial populations were expanding. Small numbers on their own, sure, but you have to understand how desert ecology works. In a dead system, small numbers cascade. The ground chemistry itself was shifting, slowly and measurably, driven by insects that had no business being there. And then the animals came. Bird species that had barely been documented in that stretch of the Tannisraft started showing up near the blossoming shrubs. Small mammals were spotted closer to the colonies than any baseline survey had ever recorded. A tiny ecosystem was assembling itself, link by link, around a handful of impossible colonies that hadn't existed 6 months earlier. You could almost watch it build in order. First the plants responding to the pollination, then insects other than the bees drawn to the flowering, then the birds that eat those insects, then the things that follow the birds, each layer pulling in the next, the way a single thread can start to weave a whole net. In a green place, none of this would even be a headline. In the middle of one of the deadliest deserts on Earth, it was the most surprising thing many of these researchers had ever recorded. And it was being driven by an animal that, on paper, should have been dead within hours of arriving. Halima knew exactly what this implied, and it scared her as much as it thrilled her. Because if a small seeding of colonies could trigger this kind of chain reaction in half a year, then the obvious next question was about scale. What could this mean for regions where the desert was actively swallowing farmland? For places where the native pollinators had already collapsed and the land was dying for lack of them? She didn't have answers. What she had was a decision to make, and it was a hard one. To really know what these bees were, she would have to do the one thing every instinct screamed against: walk away and leave them completely alone. Left alone. So that's what they did. 12 months, no intervention, no resupply, no correction of any kind. The colonies would face the Tanna's Roof entirely on their own terms, and Halima's team would only watch from a distance through drone feeds and sensor data, unable to lift a finger no matter what they saw. The first weeks nearly broke her. The footage showed populations dropping hard. Extreme heat events battered clusters that had been stable for weeks. Sandstorms rolled through and erased colonies she'd been tracking by name in her notes. Every flatline signal landed like a small personal loss, and there was nothing, absolutely nothing, she was allowed to do about it. And then the curve bent. The decline slowed. The colonies that had ridden out the worst of the early storms started to stabilize, and what replaced the chaos was something quieter and far more deliberate. Foraging trips got tighter and more coordinated. Flight paths rerouted in real time around the most dangerous open terrain as the dunes shifted. It stopped looking like desperation and started looking like routine. Across the year, the site recorded daytime highs reaching 52 degrees Celsius, and nights dropping back toward freezing, flash floods tearing through sand channels, dust storms arriving in cycles the colonies eventually seemed to anticipate. Every day that passed without total collapse felt, to the people watching, like the data itself was holding its breath. What they were accumulating without being able to touch it was becoming one of the most detailed records of insect endurance under extreme stress ever captured, month after month of it. They could trace, almost in real time, how the colonies answered each new threat as it arrived: the communal water sharing, the coordinated retreats underground when the heat spiked, the way risk seemed to get factored into when and where the bees flew. There were stretches where the feeds went quiet for days, and Halima would sit there convinced it was finally over, that the last storm had taken them. Then a colony would surface again on the sensors, smaller, battered, but still there. But a record is not the same thing as an answer. The only way to know what had really happened down in those tunnels was to go back in. And when the 12 months were up, Halima walked back onto that site with no idea what she was about to find. What they found. It stopped her where she stood. The colonies weren't just alive, they had grown. The bees had built permanent underground networks, tunnels linking chamber to chamber, holding humidity in, keeping the worst of the heat out, shielding the population from the predators working the surface above. These were not panic shelters thrown together in a crisis. They were communities, organized, functional, built for the long haul, with corridors and chambers and storage areas that pointed toward planning, not blind instinct. The drone imagery showed the tunnel systems running across real distances, linking multiple colony hubs into a single distributed network, so that no one storm or collapse could take the whole settlement down at once. It was the kind of layout a careful engineer might draw to keep a remote outpost alive, except no one had drawn it. The bees had arrived at it themselves in the dark, in the heat, over a single year, with no blueprint and no second chances. But that wasn't the thing that got her. The thing that got her was waiting in the brood. New generations had been born in the desert, confirmed development inside several colonies, eggs, larvae, and pupae, moving through their stages in an environment that conventional science had flatly written off as lethal to reproduction. Halima stood over that reading for a long moment, and when she finally spoke, the people there said her voice barely worked. She said something close to this: "We didn't keep something alive out here, we started something." And then she said the part she'd been afraid to write down for a year: "They're not surviving anymore. They're a population." That was the line nobody had dared to cross in their heads. Survivors hang on until the next disaster wipes the slate. A self-sustaining, reproducing population passes its hard-won traits forward, one generation reinforcing the next. The escalation was complete. Survivors had become pioneers, and pioneers had become a population that could carry itself into a future without a single human being involved. Honeybees, a species studied for centuries, whose needs everyone assumed were fixed, had quietly rewritten their own operating conditions in one of the most extreme places on Earth. The team packed their gear in near silence. They had walked into the desert with a question and walked out with something heavier than an answer, and the obvious next thought was the one that traveled fastest once the data left that site. What it means. The moment the findings reached other researchers, the conversation changed. People who had spent entire careers mapping the limits of bee behavior were suddenly staring at evidence that those limits had been drawn in the wrong place, and the implications went off like a chain of fuses. Could bees like these become a tool for regions where the desert was advancing and the pollinators were already gone? Could they be introduced into collapsed ecosystems to kickstart recovery? Could whatever drove their adaptation be understood, maybe even guided, in other species fighting their own losing battles? You have to understand, every one of those questions carried as much risk as promise. The wrong intervention in a fragile ecosystem can do damage that takes decades to undo, and Halima was the first to say it out loud. Excitement, she warned, is not the same thing as caution. But people were listening anyway. Farmers in drought-stricken regions. Governments overseeing land the desert had already eaten. Restoration groups working degraded landscapes everywhere. And then there was the footage. Bees moving across open sand. Bees sheltering under rock. Bees pulling dew off bare plant stems in the gray light before sunrise, doing the impossible in a place with no reason to tolerate them. It was the kind of thing you watch twice because you don't quite believe it the first time. Life arguing with the desert and slowly somehow winning the argument. And the honest truth is that the biggest questions are still open. Nobody can yet say for certain how the bees changed so fast, whether it was buried in genetics waiting for the right pressure, or learned behavior spreading through the colonies, or some combination science doesn't have a clean name for yet. Nobody knows if it would work twice, or whether the Tanasrauf colonies were a one-time accident of timing and luck, and a few stubborn batches that happened to land in the right place. Those are the exact questions Halima's team is still chasing, and they're careful to say so because the gap between what they saw and what they can explain is still wide. That gap is not a flaw in the story, it's the most interesting part of it. Here's where it lands. What happened in the Tanasrauf was not a solution. It was a glimpse, a suggestion that the line between what's possible and what isn't might be far less fixed than we ever assumed, and that the next real breakthrough in resilience might not come from a lab at all, but from creatures already out there rewriting their own rules while no one is watching. The desert kept most of its secrets, the way it always does. But for the first time, something small and fragile walked into the heart of it, survived, and came back changed. So here's the real question I want to leave you with. If a few thousand frozen bees can do this to the deadliest desert on Earth in a single year, what else have we been wrong about? Drop your answer in the comments because I read them, and I want to know what you think really happened out there. If this story got under your skin even a little, subscribe and stick around, because the next one goes somewhere even stranger. I'll see you there.